80 years. 8 merciless decades chained to a black iron wheelchair beneath a crown of rubies and thorns, ruling a vampire kingdom from a castle of firelight, gold, and grief, while the curse slowly hollowed him from the inside out. Every renowned healer declared the blood oath unbreakable. Every witch who touched the darkness screamed and fled. Every priest who entered the royal chamber never left the same. They said King Lucian Draven was beyond saving. They said the curse was eternal. They were wrong. It wouldn't take a royal sorcerer or an ancient grimoire to shatter 80 years of darkness. It would take a desperate single mother, her frightened little boy, and a pair of hands that understood wounds no spell had ever been able to see. The year that broke Lucian Draven was not the year the curse began. It was the night he chose his kingdom over himself. He was 22 years old, golden, fearless, beloved by humans and vampires alike, the prince who carried his people's hope the way sunlight carries warmth, effortlessly, without knowing he was doing it at all. They called him the Shield of the Crimson Realm. They carved his face into the stone above the castle gates. Then came the Night of Ash. An immortal coven called the Sisters of the Veil arrived at the borders of the Crimson Realm with a single demand: surrender the kingdom or watch it burn. Lucian refused, and in the space between one heartbeat and the next, he made a sacrifice so complete it split his soul in two, pouring his own humanity into a barrier of ancient fire that turned the coven's darkness back and saved every life inside those walls. The coven did not forgive him. By sunrise, they had bound him with the blood oath, a living curse designed not merely to destroy, but to punish. It chained his body to pain. It shackled his power to shadow. And deepest of all, where no healer's eye could reach, it wrapped itself around the guilt of a man who had saved thousands and still could not stop hearing the screams of those he had lost. He woke up a vampire king, white-haired and red-eyed, ruling from the darkness behind velvet curtains and closed doors. He became less a man and more a legend, the kind people whispered about and children were warned never to seek. He gave orders through a loyal steward named Alaric. He held court by firelight. He did not leave the castle. He did not need to. The kingdom feared him enough to obey. Over the next 8 decades, Lucian sent for healers the way dying men send for prayers, not because he believed it would work, but because some stubborn, battered part of him had not yet given up entirely. Witches came bearing moon water and bone ash. Priests arrived with sacred texts and trembling hands. Sorcerers of legendary reputation walked through his chamber doors and left shattered. Some failed quietly. Some wept. One went mad before reaching the courtyard gate. By his 100th year as king, Lucian had dismissed the last healer, sealed the royal chambers, and accepted the truth every expert in the known world had told him. The curse could not be broken. He would suffer until he died, and then the kingdom would fall. He stopped hoping. 30 miles from the castle walls, in a crumbling village where the roads turned to mud in winter and the market stalls ran empty before noon, Amber Hayes was fighting a very different war. She was 31 years old, running on 4 hours of sleep, and whatever warmth was left in the fireplace coals each morning. The table beside her bed was buried beneath healers' ledgers, past due debts, and the half-empty bottles of medicine she stretched further than any apothecary would have recommended. Her son Eli, 8 years old, dark-eyed and serious in the way children become serious when they understand that their mother is tired, slept in the next room beneath 3 blankets. A small, rattling cough following him into his dreams. Amber had been a widow for 3 years. The illness that had taken her husband left slowly, the way bad things often do, long enough for her to hope, and then long enough to understand that hope was not enough. She worked as a servant and village healer, treating farmers' broken hands, midwives' aching backs, and children's fevers with the tools she had: clean cloth, herbal compounds, and something she had never been able to fully explain. She had a gift. It was not magic, not the kind the kingdom's trained spellcasters would have recognized. She didn't recite incantations over sacred fires or draw symbols in silver chalk. She simply placed her hands on a person and felt what was broken inside them. Not bones, not blood. The places where pain had taken root in the body's memory, the invisible wounds that kept living long after their cause had passed. The other villagers called her the woman with the healing hands. She called it a burden and went back to work. It was a cold night in late autumn when Alaric arrived at her door. He did not knock loudly. He knocked the way men knock when they are trying not to be seen. 2 careful raps, then silence. Amber opened the door holding a candle, her shawl pulled tight, and found a silver-haired man in a castle steward's coat standing in the mud. He was old and tired and clearly desperate in the way only men sent on impossible errands ever look. Amber Hayes. His voice was formal, but there was something raw beneath it. I represent the royal house of the Crimson Realm. My king is dying. Every healer we have ever called has failed him. I am told you have hands unlike any in this kingdom. I am asking you, not commanding, asking to come. Amber looked at the purse of gold he offered, looked at the dark behind him, looked back at Eli's bedroom door. She said no. Then, 3 days later, Eli's cough worsened. The medicine ran out. The last coin in the house bought bread and nothing else. Alaric was still waiting at the inn at the end of the road. She had known he would be. She packed 1 bag. She lifted Eli from his bed and wrapped him in the warmest blanket they owned. She walked to the inn, and when Alaric opened the carriage door, she climbed inside without looking back. The ride to the Crimson Castle felt like crossing into a different world. Because it was. The gates were iron and ancient. The torches burned dark red. The courtyard was silent in the way places become silent when fear has lived in them long enough to settle into the stones. Alaric led her through corridor after corridor of gold-framed portraits, crimson velvet and shadow, until he stopped before a pair of doors tall enough to swallow a house whole. He is difficult, Alaric said quietly. He's been disappointed many times. He will not make this easy for you. Neither will I, Amber said. The doors opened. The chamber beyond was warm with firelight and cold, with something harder to name. Bookshelves lined every wall. Candelabras burned in clusters of 3. And there, positioned before the largest fireplace Amber had ever seen, sat the most terrifying man she had ever looked at in her life. King Lucian Draven was not what she had expected. She had imagined a monster. What she found was something worse, a man who had once been beautiful and had spent 80 years learning to carry the ruin of it. He was long-limbed and pale as bone, his white hair falling in waves beneath a crown of rubies set in blackened silver. His eyes, when they found hers across the room, were red, not the red of rage, but the red of something ancient and exhausted and no longer interested in pretending otherwise. He wore black velvet and silver fastenings, the kind of clothing built to command rather than comfort. 1 ring on each hand, heavy and dark. A goblet of something deep crimson resting on his knee. He didn't look at her so much as through her. Another healer, Alaric. His voice was smooth and low and utterly without hope. I thought we agreed we were done with this particular form of self-torment. She is not like the others, Your Majesty. Lucian finally turned his gaze fully onto Amber. It moved over her slowly. Her plain dress, her village shawl, her braided hair, the child standing quietly at her side, and something behind his eyes shifted from contempt to something colder. You brought a child into my castle. He goes where I go, Amber said. Her voice was steady. She had not known it would be until it was. Lucian studied her for a long moment, the firelight catching the edges of his crown. Every healer who has walked through that door has claimed to be different. His voice was silk over gravel. They brought their sacred oils and their ancient texts and their gods-given certainty, and they all left having changed nothing. What precisely makes you believe you are the exception, village woman? Amber did not look away from him. Because I'm not here to treat the curse, she said. I'm here to find out what it's feeding on. A silence settled over the chamber so complete that Amber could hear the fire breathing. Slowly, Lucien set his goblet down. 1 hour, he said. Then you leave. I'll need your arm, Amber said, crossing the room. She knelt before the wheelchair without hesitation, and later she would not be able to explain why only that something in her gift had already begun to hum the moment she entered the room. The way a string vibrates when another note is struck nearby. She placed her hands on the back of his left hand, and the moment her skin met his, she understood 2 things simultaneously. First, the curse was alive, not dormant, not fading. Alive and moving, coiled around something deeper than blood or bone. Second, she was touching a wound 80 years old that no one had ever properly seen. She pressed carefully along the darkened veins threading up his wrist. Lucien sat rigid, jaw clenched, eyes fixed on the fire. She could feel the curse pulling away from her, defensive, territorial, the way a scar tissue walls off an old injury. She pressed deeper. Lucien's breath caught. His fingers curled against the arm of the wheelchair. And then, so quietly that Amber almost missed it, the pale hand beneath hers turned very slowly toward the light of the nearest candle. Not away from it, toward it. Amber stopped breathing. For the first time in 80 years, the Vampire King's hand had moved toward light without burning. It lasted 3 seconds. Then Lucien snatched his hand back, his red eyes cutting to hers with an expression she could not read, fury and terror, and something cracked wide open beneath both. "What did you do?" he said, and his voice, for the first time, was not smooth at all. "I didn't do anything," Amber said, her own hands trembling. "I just found the part of you that's still fighting, but finding it and freeing it were 2 entirely different things." Because Amber Hayes had just made herself visible to the only people in the world who needed Lucien to stay cursed, and they had been watching long before she knocked on Alaris's door. Dr. Haub, Vero arrived 11 minutes after Amber did. She heard him before she saw him, the precise, deliberate click of expensive boots against stone floors. The kind of walk that announces itself on purpose. He was tall and thin in the way that suggested he had always been thin, a man whose body had never softened into comfort. Silver-streaked hair, a physician's coat so white impressed it looked like armor. He stood in the doorway of the royal chamber and took in the scene. Amber kneeling before the king, her plain village hands still trembling from what had just happened, and his expression arranged itself into something that was almost but not quite a smile. "Your Majesty," he addressed Lucien without looking away from Amber. "I see our guest has begun." "She has hands," Lucien said flatly. He had retreated behind his armor again with remarkable speed. Whatever had cracked open 3 minutes ago was sealed now, his red eyes flat and unreadable, his voice smooth with contempt. "Whether they are useful hands remains to be determined." Vero crossed the room and stopped 2 feet from Amber, close enough to make the point. He looked down at her the way academics look at folk remedies, with a patience so thin it was barely distinguishable from hostility. "Village method?" he asked, nodding at her hands. "Myofascial release," Amber said. "And intuition." "Intuition." He let the words sit there a moment. "We have had 39 healers through these doors across 8 decades. 17 of them carried royal appointments. 4 were trained in academies older than this castle. They all had intuition." He paused. "May I ask what qualifies a servant woman from the outer villages to succeed where they did not?" "They were treating the wrong thing," Amber said. Vero's almost smile thinned. "The curse is a blood affliction. Every scholar in the known world agrees. Then every scholar in the known world has been looking at the surface." She rose from her knees, keeping her voice even. "The darkness in his veins is a symptom. Something underneath it is feeding the curse, something it's been attached to for a long time." A silence. Lucian was watching her now, not through her, but at her, the way a man watches something he hasn't decided whether to trust or destroy. Vero's expression did not change. Touching the curse directly has killed 3 healers, he said pleasantly. I thought you should know that before you continue. Thank you, Amber said. I'll need another hour. Vero stayed. She had expected him to leave. He positioned himself in the chair beside the bookshelf with his arms folded and his eyes fixed on her hands, and he did not move for the next 50 minutes. Lucian submitted to the examination with the particular grace of a man who has long since made his peace with being handled by strangers. He allowed her to move his arm, to press along the darkened veins that traced up from his wrist like black rivers beneath pale ice. He was sarcastic when she asked him to describe what he felt. He was coldly precise when she asked about the night the curse began. He volunteered nothing, but his body told her things his voice wouldn't. The curse was not sitting still. That was the first thing she had understood when her hands met his skin, and the longer she worked, the more certain she became. It moved. It breathed. It coiled tighter when she pressed along his left arm and loosened when she shifted away, like something intelligent making a decision about where to hide. Not a sickness, not a wound, a chain. She found the other end of it somewhere deep beneath his sternum. Not in his heart exactly, but close enough. A cold, knotted center of something ancient and guilt-ridden that the curse had wrapped itself around like a parasite around a root. She pressed her palm flat against his chest without asking permission and felt it pulse once under her hand. Lucian's jaw locked. Don't. You made a promise, Amber said quietly. The night it happened, something you swore to do and believed you failed. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. You are a healer, Lucian said, each word deliberate. Not a confessor. The curse doesn't know the difference. She pressed slightly deeper. It's been eating that guilt for 80 years, Your Majesty. It doesn't need your blood. It never did. The fire crackled. Vero shifted in his chair. Then Amber moved her hands to Lucian's forearm, following the dark veins down toward his fingers, applying slow and steady pressure the way she'd learned to do with wounds that had calcified around their own pain. Lucian stared at the far wall. His breathing was controlled, measured, the breathing of a man who has had a great deal of practice not reacting to things. She pressed into the knot at his wrist. He exhaled sharply through his nose, and his hand, without his permission, without any instruction from the man who had spent 80 years believing his body was his enemy, turned toward the window. The late afternoon sun was fading. A single slant of amber light lay across the floor between them, reaching the edge of his wheelchair like an outstretched hand. Lucian's fingers drifted into it. No smoke, no recoil, no burning. 3 seconds of silence so complete that Amber could hear the candles. Then Eli's small voice floated in from somewhere down the corridor, cheerful and completely unaware, and the spell broke. Lucian yanked his hand back. His red eyes found Amber's, and what lived inside them was not gratitude. It was the wild, cornered fury of a man who has just been ambushed by hope. That means nothing, Vero said from across the room. His voice was perfectly level, a coincidence of light and angle. The curse is not responding to. It moved, Alaric said from the doorway. The old steward's voice was barely above a whisper. He was gripping the doorframe. I saw it move. Alaric, Lucian's voice cut through the room like a blade. That will do. Nobody spoke. Lucian turned his wheelchair toward the fire with the slow, deliberate motion of a man choosing to face away from something dangerous. His left hand rested on his knee. His fingers, Amber noticed, were still faintly angled toward the light. She found Eli in the portrait gallery 20 minutes later, standing before a painting of a woman in healer's white, her dark hair pinned beneath a silver circlet. Mama, he pointed up at the painting without turning around. That lady has my mark. Amber stepped closer. The woman in the portrait was young and solemn-faced, one hand resting over her heart in the formal style of royal portraiture, and there, just visible above the collar of her robe, was a small crescent-shaped birthmark on the left side of her throat, identical to the one on Eli's. Amber stared at it for a long moment. Then she took Eli's hand. "Come," she said. "Stay close." That night, Lucian summoned Alaric to his chamber and closed the door. "The woman and the boy," he said, not looking up from the fire. "They do not leave." Alaric was quiet for a moment. "Shall I?" "Not prisoners." Lucian's voice was sharp at the edges and controlled in the middle, the voice of a man navigating something he did not entirely understand. "Move them to the protected wing. Post 2 knights at the corridor entrance. If anyone outside this castle learns she found a reaction tonight," he stopped, "they will come for her." Alaric nodded slowly. "And the child?" Lucian was quiet for long enough that the fire shifted and resettled. "The child, especially," he said. The royal library smelled of old candle wax and forgotten urgency. Amber had been there since before dawn, which was how she knew the castle's silence had layers. The deep, breathless quiet of the hours before the servants woke, and then the slightly less quiet of the hours after, when footsteps moved through distant corridors and fires were restoked and the whole enormous building shuddered back into something resembling life. She had not slept. Alaric had given her access to the restricted archive without her asking, which told her he had anticipated she would need it. The shelves back here were older, the spines cracked and faded, the titles written in a formal script that had fallen out of fashion at least 2 centuries ago. She pulled volumes by instinct more than method. Histories of the Crimson Realm, records of the Night of Ash, a thin black ledger that turned out to be a registry of every healer who had ever treated the king, annotated in Varro's precise handwriting with a single damning word beside each name: failed, 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 deceased, failed. She set that one aside and kept reading. The Sisters of the Veil appeared first as a footnote in a border war chronicle, then as a paragraph in a volume on immortal covens, then, finally, as the subject of an entire restricted manuscript written by a court scholar who had clearly been terrified while doing it. The ink pressed harder in some places than others. The handwriting changed mid-page. Amber read it twice. The blood oath, the scholar wrote, was not designed as a killing curse. It was designed as something more precise and more cruel, a believing curse. Its structure was built not to destroy the body, but to convince the soul of a specific and devastating lie, that the person who bore it had caused the suffering of everyone they loved, that every death during the Night of Ash had been Lucian's fault, that his sacrifice had not saved his people but condemned them. The coven hadn't wanted him dead. They had wanted him to wish he was. Amber closed the manuscript and sat very still in the candlelight for a long moment. Then she went to find the king. He was in the eastern corridor, alone, which she suspected was not an accident. He moved through the castle in the early mornings, Alaric had mentioned, when the halls were empty enough that no one would have to see how much the wheelchair cost him. Lucian heard her coming and stopped. He did not turn around. "The library," he said, "closes at midnight." "I didn't leave at midnight." A pause. "No, I suppose you didn't." He still did not turn. Outside the tall, narrow window beside him, the sky was the pale gray of early morning, not yet committed to being day. "Whatever you found in there, Amber, the curse isn't punishing you for what you did," she said. "It's punishing you for what you believe." Silence. "The Night of Ash." She kept her voice steady. "You made a promise. Before you sacrificed your humanity, you swore you would protect everyone, and thousands died anyway." The stillness that moved through him was not the stillness of a man who was surprised. It was the stillness of a man who has carried something so long he has forgotten. It has weight. 11,412, Lucian said quietly. "I know the number. I have always known the number. And the curse knows you know it." Amber stepped closer. It has been feeding on that for 80 years. Not your blood, not your power, your guilt. She paused. You have been trying to cure a wound that every healer kept stitching shut from the outside. It was never in your blood, Lucian. It was in the promise you made and believed you broke. He turned then, slowly. His red eyes found hers in the gray morning light, and what lived inside them was neither fury nor contempt. It was something raw and far more dangerous. You speak, he said, as though understanding it is the same as surviving it. It's not, she said, but it's where we start. He did not thank her. She had not expected him to. But that afternoon, a set of warm winter clothes appeared outside Eli's door. Small, well-made, clearly commissioned in haste and at considerable expense. No note. Ellie put them on and announced to Amber that the castle was colder than their house, but that it had better fireplaces, which was an even trade. Amber watched him pull on the coat and said nothing. 2 days later, Eli got lost, looking for the kitchens, and was found by Lucian himself in the portrait gallery, standing before the same painting Amber had noticed, asking it questions. Lucian had apparently sat there for 20 minutes answering them, which Eli reported as a completely normal occurrence. He knows all their names, Eli told Amber that evening. All the people in the paintings. Every single one. Amber looked up from the manuscript she was annotating. Did he tell you who the woman was? She asked carefully. The one with the silver circlet? Eli nodded. He said she was the first royal healer. She was the one who made the bloodline oath, that her family would always protect the vampire kings. He paused. He got really quiet after that. Amber set down her pen. She had spent 3 days cross-referencing the Royal Healer Registry against the manuscript's bloodline records, telling herself it was coincidence. A similar birthmark, a trick of old portraiture. Children looked like many things, but the registry was specific. The founding healer's bloodline had dispersed during the Night of Ash, the scholar wrote, scattered beyond the kingdom's borders, the lineage presumed lost. They had carried something rare even among gifted healers, the ability not just to feel wounds in others, but to anchor a healing, to hold a broken soul steady while it remade itself. The cure for the blood oath, the manuscript suggested in its final, terrified paragraph, had always required 2 people, the one who understood the wound and the one whose blood remembered the original oath of protection. Amber looked at her son across the firelit room. He was drawing something on a scrap of parchment, his tongue between his teeth, his small brow furrowed in concentration. The birthmark on his throat caught the light. She did not sleep that night either. The shadow creatures came at the 3rd bell. She heard them before she saw them, a sound like wet silk being dragged across stone, wrong in a way her body understood before her mind did. She was already pulling Eli from his bed when the window exploded inward, and the cold that poured through it was not winter cold. There were 3 of them, shapes more than creatures, darkness given edges and intent, pouring across the floor toward her with the focused, unhurried movement of things that have been sent rather than arrived. Amber backed against the wall with Eli behind her and no weapon and no magic and nothing but the absolute refusal to move. She did not have to hold that position long. The door came off its hinges. Lucian moved through the room the way she imagined he had moved 80 years ago, before the curse, before the wheelchair, before 8 decades of slow diminishment had convinced everyone, including himself, that the predator was gone. He was still fast, terrifyingly fast. Black fire ignited along his forearms, and the shadow creatures recoiled from it with sounds that were almost voices, and he tore through them with a ferocity so complete and so cold that it was over in less than a minute. Then he stood in the wreckage of her window, breathing hard, the black fire guttering out, his hands shaking with the effort of what his body had just demanded of him. He turned. Eli was watching him with enormous eyes. Amber had her arm around her son's shoulders and her chin up. Lucian looked at them both for a long moment. Something moved across his face that had no name she could easily reach for. "They know," he said. His voice was rough at the edges. "Whatever you found, they know you found it." "I know," Amber said. He crossed the room, stopped before her, close enough that she could see the tremors still moving through his jaw, the cost of what he'd just done written plainly across him for once, unguarded and unhidden. "You are moving to the royal wing tonight," he said. "Both of you." "Lucian, this is not a request." His red eyes dropped to Eli briefly, then back to hers. "No darkness touches what is under my roof." He said it the way men say things they have not said in a very long time. Like a vow retrieved from somewhere deep and dusty, turned over in the hands, found to still be whole. Amber held his gaze. "All right," she said quietly. And for the first time since she had entered the Crimson Castle, she believed him. The royal wing was quieter than the rest of the castle. Amber noticed it the first morning, a particular quality of stillness, as though the walls here were thicker not just with stone, but with intention. 2 vampire knights stood at the corridor entrance without speaking or moving, and when Eli waved at them on his way to breakfast, neither responded, which Eli found enormously funny, and Amber found quietly reassuring. She resumed treatment on the 3rd day. Lucian submitted to it with less resistance than before, which she understood was not the same as acceptance. He sat by the window in the late afternoon light, the light he still flinched from instinctively, the way a man flinches from a flame even after the burn has healed, and he endured her hands on his arms and his wrists and the dark, knotted center of the curse beneath his sternum. And he said almost nothing, which was how she knew the sessions were working. A man like Lucian Draven filled silence with words when he was in control. When he wasn't, he went very still and very quiet and stared at something in the middle distance. And that was how Amber learned to read his pain. Not by what he said, but by when he stopped. On the 5th day, his eyes changed. She had her palm pressed flat against his forearm, working along the curse's edge when it happened. A flicker, there and gone in less than a second, the deep burning red shifting to something cooler and clearer. Silver blue, the color she would learn later from Alaric, of his eyes before the night of ash. Lucian didn't notice. She didn't tell him. But she thought about it for the rest of the evening. On the 7th day, he moved his left leg. Not far. Not voluntarily, exactly. More a response than a decision, his body reacting to something the curse had been suppressing for decades. He stared down at it afterward with an expression she had seen once before on the face of a farmer in her village who had been told his injured hand would never close again. And then, one morning, it had. The expression of a man being ambushed by the possible. "Don't," Amber said quietly. He looked up. "Don't decide it means nothing before you've given it a moment," she said. "Just let it be what it is." Lucian looked at her for a long time without speaking. The afternoon light was coming through the window at an angle that caught the edges of his white hair and the rubies in his crown, and there was something in his face that was not quite the mask, and not quite what lived beneath it. Something in between still deciding. "You are very strange," he said finally. "For a village healer." "You are very strange," she said. "For a king." The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile. Something that hadn't decided yet if it was allowed to be one. Ellie asked Lucian, on a Tuesday, whether the crown was heavy. They were in the library, Lucian reviewing correspondence at the large central table. Ely nominally looking at illustrated histories but actually watching Lucian with the focused curiosity of a child who has identified an interesting specimen and intends to understand it fully. Lucian looked up from his papers. "Yes," he said. "Do you have to wear it all the time?" "No." "Then why do you?" A pause. "Because people need to remember what I am." Eli considered this with appropriate seriousness. "What are you?" "A king." "My mum says you're also just a man." The silence that followed was the kind Amber had learned to recognize. The kind that happened when something reached Lucian in a place he hadn't fortified. She watched from across the room as he looked at her son. This small, serious boy who had no fear of him and no agenda and no interest whatsoever in the elaborate architecture of distance Lucien had spent 80 years constructing. "Your mother," Lucien said carefully, "says a great many things." "She's usually right," Eli said, and went back to his book. Lucien sat very still for a moment. Then he went back to his correspondence, and Amber looked away before he could catch her watching. She found the first discrepancy on a Wednesday. She had been cross-referencing the healer registry, Vero's annotated ledger of every failed treatment, against the original session records stored separately in the archive. A routine check, or so she told herself. She was looking for patterns in what had failed, trying to understand what approach to avoid. What she found instead was something else entirely. The records didn't match, not in small ways. In specific, deliberate, careful ways that would only be visible to someone who knew exactly what she was looking for. A healer named Soren, 17 years ago, had documented using a compound of silver root and ash bloom, a combination Amber recognized as one of the few preparations capable of temporarily weakening a blood curse's grip. In Vero's registry, the same session was recorded as using common nightshade and river clay. Nightshade and river clay would have done nothing. Worse than nothing, nightshade introduced a low toxicity that would have agitated the curse rather than calmed it. She pulled another record, then another. Poisoned herbs, altered ritual sequences, a sacred text on blood oath dissolution that had 3 pages missing. Cleanly removed, the edges too neat to be accidental. Amber sat back in her chair. 39 healers across 80 years, and not one of them had failed on their own. That same evening, in the lower physician's quarters, Dr. Vero locked his door. The black mirror on his wall was old, older than the castle, older than the curse. Its surface never fully reflective, always slightly darker than the room around it. He pressed 2 fingers to its center and waited. Morvana's face surfaced through the dark like something rising from deep water. She was ageless and pale and beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when they have fed well for a very long time. "Well?" Her voice came through the glass without sound, felt rather than heard. "The village woman is close." Vero kept his voice even, which required effort. Morvana had a way of looking at a person as though she were already deciding what to do with what remained of them. She has identified the guilt structure. She understands the curse is feeding on his oath. If she is given another 2 weeks, she will not have 2 weeks. "I can introduce compounds into the next session." Set her back considerably. "No." The word pressed against the inside of the mirror. "The girl is too careful. She'll find the contamination." A pause. "We need another approach." Vero waited. "The child," Morvana said. "Bring me the child." Eli was gone by the 3rd bell. Amber woke to the silence of it, the particular silence of a room that has a sleeping child in it, and then, suddenly, doesn't. She was across the corridor and through the nursery door in seconds, her heart already understanding before her eyes confirmed it. The bed was empty. The blanket was on the floor. The small pair of boots she had lined up neatly by the door the night before were still there, which meant he had not left on his own. On the wall above the bed, burned into the stone in a script too precise to be accidental, was a symbol she recognized from the restricted manuscript: a veil, a circle, 3 lines beneath, the sigil of the Sisters of the Veil. Amber stood in the empty nursery with the burned symbol above her and the small boots on the floor below her, and she did not scream because screaming would not bring him back. She turned and walked to find Lucien, and behind her, in the lower physician's quarters, Vero extinguished his lamp and waited for morning. She did not have to say anything. Lucien took one look at her face in the doorway of his chamber. The stillness of it. The terrible controlled stillness of a mother who has not yet allowed herself to feel what she is feeling because feeling it would mean it was real, and he was already moving. "Where?" he said. "The nursery." His boots are still there, Her voice was flat and precise, the way voices get when everything underneath them is the opposite of flat and precise. There's a coven's sigil burned into the wall above his bed. The change that moved through Lucian was not loud. It was the opposite of loud, a compression, a drawing inward of something that had been half restrained for weeks. The dying king folding away and something much older and considerably more dangerous taking his place. His red eyes went very dark. His hands on the wheelchair's arms went very still. "Send for Alaric," he said. And Varro. Varro arrived first. He took in the nursery with a physician's systematic gaze, the empty bed, the burned sigil, the boots, and shook his head with practiced gravity. "Shadow creatures," he said. "The same thing that attacked her room 3 nights ago. I warned you the wards on the outer wing were insufficient." "His sleeve," Amber said. Varro stopped. She was looking at his left forearm, where the cuff of his physician's coat had shifted slightly out of alignment. A smear of green-gray residue clung to the fabric, half hidden, the kind of mark that comes from handling fresh herbs in darkness and haste. Ash bloom and crushed silverthorn. The precise combination used to temporarily suppress a ward against shadow passage. She had read it in the restricted archive 4 days ago. "That is a common medicinal compound," Varro began. "It's a ward suppressant," Amber said. "Mixed fresh within the last 3 hours. You opened the nursery to them." She looked at him directly, and what was in her face was not fury. It was something quieter and more absolute. "You have been opening doors for them for 80 years. The room went very still. Then Varro's hand moved, and the cursed magic that came from it was nothing like the shadow creatures. It was precise and cold and targeted. A physician's understanding of the body turned into something that found the gaps between ribs and aimed for them. Amber had no time to move. The impact threw her sideways into the wall. Pain cracked through her shoulder and the room tilted, and she heard Alaric's shout from the corridor, and then heard something else, a sound she had not heard before. Low and tearing and wrong in the way the shadow creatures had been wrong, except this wrongness was coming from Lucian. She looked up. He was trying to stand. The curse was tearing through him visibly, dark veins spidering up his neck and jaw, his hands shaking violently against the wheelchair arms, his breath coming in ragged pieces. Every inch of upward movement cost him something she could see and something she couldn't. His face had gone white as bone. His red eyes were blown wide with pain. He was still rising. "Lucian." She was across the room without deciding to move, her injured shoulder screaming, both hands pressing against his chest, against the cold, knotted center where the curse had lived for 80 years. "Stop. Stop, you'll move," he said through his teeth. "Listen to me." She pressed harder. His heart was hammering under her palms, racing with effort and pain, and something beneath both that she recognized from the restricted manuscript, the curse feeding, surging, using his own will against him. "It's lying to you. Right now, it's telling you that you can't, that you're not." Her voice broke slightly and she pushed through it. "That you are not the man who can protect someone. That you never were. That everyone who trusted you paid for it." She held his gaze. "It has been telling you that lie for 80 years. And it is lying." Something in his face fractured. The curse surged. She felt it through her palms, like a wave hitting a shore. And then Lucian Draven, vampire king of the Crimson Realm, who had not stood on his own feet longer than most people in the castle had been alive, stood, not smoothly, not triumphantly, with a sound that was almost a cry and wasn't quite, with every muscle in his body fighting every other muscle, with the dark veins blazing across his jaw and his hand shaking and his crown catching the torchlight as he came up and fully agonizingly upright. He placed his body between Amber and Varro. The corridor outside had gone absolutely silent. Alaric was in the doorway. Behind him, 2 knights. Behind them a kitchen servant who had no reason to be there, and a chambermaid who had heard the noise and would later tell everyone. She saw, and everyone they told would tell someone else. until the story had spread to every corner of the Crimson Castle before morning. The king stood. Varro looked at him, truly looked, for perhaps the first time in decades, and what moved across the physician's face was not guilt. It was calculation. He ran. Not through the door, through the wall, a shadow passage, dark and silent, the kind that required a ward suppressant prepared in advance by someone who had been planning an exit for some time. He was gone between one breath and the next, taking with him the one piece of information Amber needed most. Where he had taken Eli. She found the answer in the manuscript, cross-referenced against the castle's oldest territorial maps, while Lucian sat beside her and said nothing, and did not once suggest she was wrong about where to look. Alaric brought the maps. The knights stood in the corridor. Nobody slept. The ruined chapel beneath the Ashvale Mountains had appeared in the manuscript's final pages, the site where the Sisters of the Veil had originally cast a blood oath 80 years ago. A place of anchoring, the scholar had written. A place where the original terms of a blood curse could be renegotiated or made permanent. Amber set the manuscript down. "They don't want to break the curse through Eli," she said. The understanding had arrived whole and cold, the way terrible things do when they have been true for longer than you realized. They want to use his bloodline to lock it permanently. If the founding healer's lineage actively binds to the blood oath, she stopped. Lucian would never be free. The coven would feed on him indefinitely. The silence in the room was the kind that follows something that cannot be unsaid. Then Lucian spoke. "How long do we have? The ritual requires preparation. A night, maybe 2. She met his eyes. "We have to go now." He looked at Alaric, at the knights in the corridor. The map spread across the table and the burned sigil on the nursery wall was still visible through the open door. Then he reached for his crown, which had fallen when he stood, and placed it back on his head with hands that had stopped shaking. He pulled his black cloak across his shoulders. He settled back into the wheelchair with the deliberate, unhurried movement of a man who was no longer hiding what it cost him, only what he intended to do about it. "Then we take back the child," he said. "And after that, we end 80 years of fear." They were still studying the maps when the outer ward shattered. The sound it made was not an explosion. It was a silence, a sudden, total absence of the low hum that Amber had stopped noticing weeks ago. The way you stop noticing a clock until it stops ticking. Then the first screams came from the eastern courtyard and the silence filled with everything else. Lucian was already moving. "The ritual materials," he said to Amber, sharp and immediate. "Take them. Stay in the throne room. The central wards are oldest and strongest. Do not go to the courtyard for any reason." "Eli is not in the courtyard," Amber said. "Eli is in the mountains. Eli is not here yet." His voice was controlled and terrible. "And you cannot help him if you are dead. The throne room, go." She went. The castle became a different place in the space of 10 minutes. The corridors she had learned to navigate by candlelight were full of smoke and broken glass, and the sounds of fighting she could not see. Red curtains burned at the ends of hallways. A suit of ancient armor lay scattered across the grand staircase as though something enormous had walked through it without slowing. She passed 2 vampire knights running toward the eastern wing, their faces set with the particular blankness of people doing something that requires them not to think about what they are doing. She reached the throne room and barred the door. The space was vast and fire-lit, the high vaulted ceiling lost in shadow above her. The twin thrones at the far end gleaming dull gold in the torchlight. She cleared the ceremonial table near the dais with one arm and spread her materials across it. The manuscript, the compound she had prepared over 3 careful days. The silver basin Alaric had sourced from the archive without asking why. Her hands were steady. She had decided they would be, so they were. She was halfway through the preparatory sequence when the door opened. Not broke open, opened. From the inside, the bar lifting on its own, the hinges swinging with a quiet courtesy that was somehow worse than force. Varro walked through first, His physician's coat exchanged for something darker and older. Behind him came two shadow soldiers, and between them, Eli. Her son was unhurt. His face was frightened in the way that children's faces are frightened when they are trying very hard not to show it. His jaw set with a determination that cracked something in Amber's chest clean through. She made herself stay at the table. "Eli," she said, keeping her voice level. "Are you hurt?" "No," he said. His voice wobbled only slightly. "Good." She looked at Vero. "Let him go." Vero smiled. The almost smile she had distrusted from the first morning in the royal chamber. "The ritual you're preparing cannot be completed without the child's bloodline. You know that. I know that." He tilted his head. "Here is what you may not know. The blood oath did not survive 80 years because of Morvana's power. It survived because Lucian fed it himself. Every year, every decade, every night he spent choosing the kingdom over everything he personally loved." He paused. He never forgave himself for that. Not once. The curse didn't need to hold on. He held on for it. Amber was quiet for a moment. "I know," she said. Vero blinked. That, she noted with grim satisfaction, was not the response he had prepared for. "The cure isn't destroying the curse," she continued, turning back to the table. "It never was. You can't destroy guilt by attacking it. It has to be released." She unstoppered the compound, "Which means you should have taken me instead of my son because I am closer to finishing this than you realize." The doors at the far end of the throne room exploded inward. Lucian came through them the way he had come through Eli's nursery door, without slowing the black fire already burning along his forearms, the curse blazing visibly across his jaw and throat, the cost of everything written plainly across him and none of it stopping him. 3 shadow soldiers converged on him. He tore through them with a ferocity that cleared a path in seconds, and then he was between Amber and Vero took 2 very quick steps backward. "Your Majesty." Vero's voice remained steady. A man who had planned for this. "The curse is killing you faster with every movement. Stop now, and there may be something left to save." "There is nothing left that interests me in saving," Lucian said, "if it requires me to stop." He looked at Amber over his shoulder. His red eyes, she noticed, had gone silver blue at the edges. "Finish it," he said. She worked fast. Eli pulled free of the shadow soldiers when Lucian's black fire drove them back, and he crossed the throne room to her without being asked, because he was his mother's son and he had apparently decided what he was going to do before he got there. He climbed onto the chair beside the ceremonial table and looked at the silver basin in the manuscript in her hands. "Tell me what to do," he said. "Place your hand over mine when I say." He nodded. No hesitation. She pressed her palms into the compound and felt the ritual lock into place around her. The same sensation as touching Lucian's curse for the first time, but larger, now older, like stepping into a river instead of a stream. The founding healer's bloodline was not magic in the trained sense. It was something quieter, a capacity for steadiness, an ability to hold a breaking thing together long enough for it to decide to heal. She began. Behind her, Lucian fought. She did not look. She could hear the curse tearing through him in the pauses between impacts, the caught breath, the low sound of something being endured past endurance, and she kept working, kept her hands moving through the sequence, the castle shaking around them as the siege pressed against the throne room's ancient wards. "Now," she said. Eli placed his small hand over hers. The bloodline activated the way old things activate, not with a surge but with a recognition. A door, remembering it, was always unlocked. She felt it move through the ritual-like warmth through cold stone, and then she felt it reach the curse, and the curse cracked. Not broke, cracked. A fracture, thin as a hair, running through 80 years of consolidated darkness. Lucian made a sound she had never heard from him. Not pain, exactly. Something beneath pain. Something the curse had been sitting on top of for 8 decades. and the darkness began to pour out of him like smoke from a smothered fire, dark and shapeless and diminishing, the throne room filling with it briefly, and then it was just air. His eyes went fully silver blue. He fell to one knee. The room went still. Then the temperature dropped, and Morvana walked in through the ruined doors as though she had always been expected. She was exactly what the manuscript's terrified scholar had failed to fully describe, ageless in the way that things are ageless when they have consumed enough living time to replace their own. Her robes were dark. Her face was composed. She looked at the smoke still dissipating in the throne room's upper air, and at Lucian kneeling on the stone floor, and at Eli's hand still resting on Amber's. And something moved through her expression that was not quite fury and not quite fear, but lived between them. Lucian. Her voice was the voice from the black mirror, felt before heard. This is not too late to reconsider. The curse is cracked, not broken. Give me the woman and the child, and I will restore everything you have lost. Your strength, your full power, your immortality, unencumbered. Lucian raised his head. His silver blue eyes found Morvana's across the firelit throne room, and in them was something Amber recognized. The same expression he had worn when he turned toward the window that first afternoon, when his hand had drifted toward the light. Not hope. The decision that hope was allowed. No, he said. Morvana looked at him for one long moment. Then she moved, faster than shadow, faster than thought, and the cursed blade in her hand found Amber before anyone in the room could close the distance between them. Not the heart, the side. Deliberate, survivable if treated quickly. A physician's knowledge of the body turned again to cruelty, enough to drop Amber to the floor. Enough to put Lucian in the position of choosing between finishing what she had started and pulling her back from the edge of what came next. Amber hit the stone and felt the cold of the blade and heard Eli make a sound she never wanted to hear again. She looked up at Lucian. His face had gone white. The silver blue of his eyes blazed in the firelight, the crack in the curse running visibly through the dark veins at his throat. The whole architecture of 80 years of darkness balanced on the edge of a single choice. Save her, or save himself. He did not hesitate. That was the thing Alaric would tell people afterward in the years when the story had become the kind of story people asked to hear again. That there was no pause, no visible moment of calculation, no weighing of the options. Lucian Draven looked at Amber on the stone floor and made a decision that 80 years of suffering had been quietly building toward, and he made it in less than a second. He pressed both hands to the crack in the curse, not to close it, to open it. What he said was not words, or not words in any language Amber could name. It was older than that, a release, spoken from somewhere the curse had never managed to reach. The part of him that had survived 8 decades of darkness by going very deep and very still and simply waiting. He had saved his kingdom once by sacrificing himself. He saved it again the same way, except this time the sacrifice was not made from duty or guilt or the cold calculus of a prince weighing lives against lives. It was made from love. The blood oath knew the difference. The crack split open. What came out of him was not darkness, exactly. It was more like pressure. 80 years of accumulated grief and guilt, and the specific anguish of a man who had believed himself monstrous for so long that the belief had become indistinguishable from identity. All of it releasing at once, pouring upward through the throne room's vaulted ceiling and gone. Lucian collapsed forward onto his hands. The dark veins at his throat and jaw faded, not instantly, but steadily, the way ice fades at the edge of spring, receding until the skin beneath them was simply skin. His eyes, when he raised his head, were silver blue and clear and entirely, unmistakably his own. Morvana made a sound. It was the first sound Amber had heard from her that was not composed, and it was not a sound that had any dignity in it. She pressed one hand to her own chest as though something there had been abruptly removed, and her face, for one unguarded moment, showed exactly what she was beneath the centuries of cultivated terror, something that had fed on another person's suffering for so long that it had forgotten how to exist without it. The sunrise found the shattered windows. It came in the way sunrises come when they are not expected, not gently, but completely, filling every crack and broken pane with light that had no interest in being stopped. It reached Morvana first. She turned toward it, and then away, and then there was simply nothing where she had been. No drama, no final words. Just ash settling onto the throne room floor with a quiet that felt like the end of a sound that had been playing for 80 years. The shadow soldiers dissolved. The cursed wolves outside went silent. Somewhere in the eastern courtyard, a vampire knight said something that was later repeated so many times it became impossible to verify, but that everyone who heard it agreed felt true. It's over. Amber was still on the floor. The wound in her side was real and deep and required attention she was not currently in a position to provide for herself. She was aware of this in a distant, almost academic way because the closer and more immediate thing was Lucian crossing the throne room floor to her. Walking. Not smoothly. Not as he had once walked 80 years ago before the night of ash. With effort and pain and the particular unsteadiness of a body relearning something it had been forbidden for decades. He listed slightly to the left. He caught himself on the ceremonial table with one hand. He kept going. He knelt beside her, and his hands, warm, she noticed, not cold as they had been in those first sessions, pressed carefully around the wound. And he looked at her face with an expression she did not have immediate words for something that had been building for weeks behind all that red-eyed composure and was now simply present unhidden, not interested in being hidden. "You are going to be fine," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm going to make sure of it." "I know that too." Illy appeared at her other side, dropping to his knees, his small hands finding hers with the focused urgency of a child who has been very frightened and has arrived at the other side of it. She squeezed his fingers. He squeezed back hard enough to hurt, which was exactly right. "Mama." His voice was steady, which cost him something. She could tell. "The bad lady is gone." "Yes," Amber said. And he walked. Eli looked at Lucian with wide, serious eyes. "I saw him walk." Lucian met the boy's gaze. Something in his expression shifted. The thing that had been shifting incrementally since a Tuesday afternoon in the library when a child had asked him what he was. "I did," Lucian said. "My mum fixed you," Eli said. Lucian looked at Amber. "She did," he said quietly. "Though she will tell you she only found the part of me that was already trying." Amber would have smiled if the wound hadn't chosen that moment to remind her of its presence. She settled for pressing her hand over his where it rested against her side and felt his fingers close around hers with the careful certainty of a man who had decided, without drama, not to let go. He carried her out at sunrise. This became the image, the one rendered later in paint and tapestry and the illustrated histories that Eli would one day read to children of his own. Not the battle, not the darkness pouring out of the throne room. Not Morvana turning to ash in the morning light. The image that lasted was simpler and harder to explain and true in the way that only the things that actually happened ever are. Lucian Draven, walking on his own feet for the first time in 80 years, carrying Amber Hayes through the castle's main doors into the first dawn he had seen since the night of ash. The kingdom was already gathering. Word had traveled the way word travels in small kingdoms when something impossible occurs, not through any single announcement but through the instinctive collective recognition that something has shifted, that the world is different from how it was yesterday, that whatever fear has been living in the air for as long as anyone can remember has exhaled and not returned. They came from the village at the castle's base, and from the market roads, and from the farmsteads along the northern border. Humans and vampires standing together on the castle hill in the early morning cold. Looking up, Lucian stood in the light. It fell across him the way it falls across things that have been kept from it too long. Greedily, thoroughly, without reservation. He did not flinch. He did not turn away. He stood in it with Amber in his arms and Eli at his side, and he let it have him completely, and the kingdom below saw their cursed king standing in the sunrise and understood without being told that the 80 years were over. Someone began to kneel. Then, someone else. Then the whole gathered crowd, human and vampire alike, slowly and without instruction, until the hillside was full of bowed heads, and the only ones standing were the three on the castle steps. Ujin looked out over them for a long moment. Then he looked down at Amber. "You should probably let Alaric treat this wound," he said. "Probably," she agreed. "And then sleep. And then sleep. And then sleep. And then," he stopped. "And then we have a great deal of work to do," she finished. The corner of his mouth moved. This time it completed the journey. The work took years, which was appropriate. The things worth doing usually do. The castle changed first, not in structure but in character. The way places change when the people inside them change. The throne room became a healing hall. The restricted archive was open to scholars. The portrait gallery gained new faces alongside the old ones, and the woman in healer's white with the silver circlet was given a proper placard at last. Her name and bloodline recorded correctly for the first time in 3 generations. Amber became royal healer, then queen in that order, because she insisted on the order. She continued treating anyone who came to the castle gates, royal appointment or not, because some things did not change with a crown. Eli grew up knowing the names of everyone in the portraits. He learned the healing arts from his mother and the responsibilities of rulership from Lucian, and he carried both with the particular grace of a child who was raised to understand that compassion and courage were not opposites. He would become, in time, the kingdom's protector. But that was a different story, still in the making. The legend of the unbreakable curse became what Amber had said it would in those first terrified days in the royal library. Not a story of despair, proof of something. That the wounds which seem most permanent are often the ones most precisely misunderstood. That guilt, given enough time, convinces itself it is identity. That healing is not the same as fixing, and that the difference matters enormously. And on the anniversary of the sunrise, every year, without exception, 3 figures stood together on the castle steps at dawn. A king who had learned to carry both darkness and light, and had found them easier to carry together. A healer who had knelt before a cursed throne with nothing but her hands and the refusal to look away from what she found there. A boy with a birthmark on his throat and his mother's eyes, who had placed his small hand over hers at exactly the right moment and held on. The sun came up. They stayed until it was fully risen. That was enough. That had always been enough.